especially today, I think diversity, inclusion, equity are all very much top of mind, but we're not always sure what we're talking about. And it can depend on what context we're speaking about these topics in. So when I think about privilege, and I should actually also mention, this is Felicia again speaking, when I think about privilege, I actually go first to our group memberships. And so as individuals, as humans, we all have different social identity groups that make up who we are. And what I mean by social identity groups is these are socially constructed categories to which we are assigned as individuals based on a number of different characteristics like physical, cultural, linguistic. So this is what most people tend to think about when they think about diversity. And of course, I'm talking not just about what the visible characteristics and elements of diversity are, like race, ethnicity, gender, but also the ones that may not be as visible, things like ability, disability, first language, cultural backgrounds, things like that. And so all of these memberships make up each of us who we are. And so when we start thinking about privilege, the way that I like to define and think about privilege is it's societal power that's based on those different group memberships, because some of those memberships will allow us certain access, certain outcomes, certain privileges, and others will not, or take those away from us. And so that's how I start to think about that.
And how does it, I mean, when we're describing it in the workplace, I guess, could you give some examples of, privilege in the workplace? When people say that, are they mostly referring to, white male CEOs? I mean, are we talking about, I guess, I don't even know how to ask the question, but give me some examples of what we would define it as in the workplace.
Yeah. There's a number of different ways. And again, I think this is going to be very contextual. So I think for the purpose of our discussion right now, we'll probably default to tech. And then in tech, my understanding of it will be that the dominant groups tend to be white men and cisgendered heterosexual men. Obviously, that's, a pretty broad statement, but that's kind of what we tend to default when we think about tech. And so if we're thinking about what privilege looks like in that context, privilege is basically that those things that you don't have to think about that afford you benefits. So, for example, for me, I'm not a white man, but I am a biracial woman in tech. But I do have privilege based on some of my own individual group membership. So, for example, I'm heterosexual. And here in the US, that tends to be a dominant group identity. So for me, when I go through life, I don't have to worry about if I were to move outside of Boston to a different state, would I be able to marry my partner? Or would I be threatened to have my job taken away or be fired because of my sexual orientation? In the workplace context, it's even small things like assuming that you'll get Christmas off and not caring or worrying or thinking about other holidays that might be really important to other religious groups that are not part of that dominant privileged conversation.
And I can add to that as well. So another, I think, top of mind example for a lot of people when they think about it in the workplace is bathroom use, which is it's but even sometimes you can even think of, people with disabilities not being able to reach certain things or things that we just take for granted, not being able to have access to certain, literal physical spaces because of limitations. It's exactly what Felicia said. It's the default, and trying to think about, so people who are privileged don't have to think about their situation. Another example that maybe people don't even think about a lot because there's a lot of invisibility to this is, we think about for people who might be alcoholics, a lot of times there's beer kegs everywhere in happy hours. And that can be really hard for people who are in that situation or, new mothers. I think there's a growing movement now to having nursing rooms, but that's really, really new. So basically, all of these different groups don't have the privilege out of the gate.
Right.
I think too, tying it back to the workplace, and this is something we talk about and think about a lot, it's also things like, pay equity, who gets paid what. And, there's research study after research study that continues to come out about, the differences in gender. And I'll just say, men versus women for the purpose of this discussion, but, men versus women in terms of who gets what. And even when women are asking for equal pay, they don't always get it because that is a backlash. And, who gets promoted, who's getting lifted up because they're looked at as aggressive in the sense that they're going after business and they're going after clients and they're confident versus being described as bitchy. All of these things. Or greedy or selfish or, there's a lot of different ways that this privilege can show up. And again, I think a lot of it ties back to this idea that people with privilege are oftentimes not aware that they possess that privilege.
Mm-hmm.